Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we unravel big ideas, bold contradictions, and, well, the often unseen truths behind some of development's most common concepts. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a really powerful and, I think, provocative chapter by Uma Kothari. It's titled Power, Knowledge, and Social Control in Participatory Development. And this chapter comes from the groundbreaking book Participation, The New Tyranny, which Kothari actually co-edited with Bill Cook. Now, this isn't your typical development playbook, not at all. Kothari takes a really hard look at how this seemingly noble idea of participation is often tangled up in some quiet, pretty pervasive forms of control. Think about how meetings get framed, who really gets heard in those meetings, and maybe which knowledge is seen as valid in these processes. So our mission today is basically to put participation under the microscope, asking some, yes, uncomfortable but necessary questions about what it's truly about and what its impact really is. We're going to try and peel back the layers here.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, I think, is how Kothari flips the script on participation. Because for decades, right, especially from the 1990s onwards, participation was really championed globally. It was seen as this almost a silver bullet for development, a way to cut costs, empower communities, make sure projects were locally relevant, all good things on the surface. But Kothari asks us to look deeper. She argues that this very widespread adoption can actually mask some very subtle yet profound power dynamics. The core insight, really, that she offers is that participation isn't just some benevolent idea floating around. It can subtly, quietly actually enforce control. So we're not just asking what participation is, but maybe how it functions as a form of social control. And this raises a really important, maybe even uncomfortable question. Is participation always a genuine democratic tool? Or can it sometimes be, well, a managerial strategy designed mainly to gain compliance? You're getting buy-in for plans already made.
That's such a crucial distinction, isn't it? And it shifts our perspective immediately. Okay, so let's begin with the basics then. What truly qualifies as genuine participation? And maybe more critically, who gets to decide that definition? Because it really feels like everyone says they're doing it. Think about a common scenario, one many of us have probably encountered. An NGO or maybe a corporate social responsibility team states quite proudly, "We consulted the community." But we really have to push past that surface statement, don't we, and ask, was that a meaningful dialogue? Was it a truly two-way street where the input genuinely shaped what happened next? Or was it maybe more like a structured checklist exercise, where information was extracted rather than ideas being co-created? Or, even more bluntly, perhaps, was it simply a done deal just dressed up as inclusion, where decisions made in, far-off offices were merely validated after the fact? Kothari suggests that participation can often be kind of retrofitted just to rubber stamp decisions that were essentially final long before that first community meeting ever even took place. It becomes a sort of performance, right? A stamp of approval rather than an authentic engagement. It's almost like being asked for your opinion on the paint color, but the house is already built.
Exactly. And building on that point about whose agenda really matters, Kothari really delves into whose priorities ultimately set the tone in these so-called participatory spaces. Is it genuinely the community's vision that drives the project forward? Or is it subtly, or maybe even overtly, the funder's agenda or the implementer's goals? She highlights how the very language we use, like terms like beneficiaries or target groups or even stakeholders, how these can subtly reinforce existing, often unequal power structures. These terms, they seem neutral, but they can frame people as passive recipients of aid or like units to be managed, rather than as active agents with their own knowledge and their own goals. And the chapter draws quite heavily on Michel Foucault's insight, which is profound, that power isn't just something that flows top down, from governments to citizens or from big institutions to communities. Instead, Foucault argues power is inherent in all social relationships. It pervades our everyday interactions, our structures, and crucially, it's deeply intertwined with knowledge. Power shapes what information gets collected, what kind of knowledge is produced, and ultimately what's deemed valid or true within these processes. Think of it this way. Power isn't just about giving orders. It's about defining the categories, shaping the narratives, influencing the very truths that govern how we interact. Kothari shows us how this plays out in participatory development. If an external institution decides what kind of data is valuable or what problems count as real, they're exercising a subtle form of power, even while they're inviting people to participate. It boils down to whose definition of reality counts.
That makes perfect sense. And it brings us right to the symbolic side of participation. If power is also about defining truth, then how do we spot those early warning signs? The signs that participation is merely symbolic, just a kind of theater and not truly structural, not something that actually shifts power and changes outcomes. Can a project really claim success and participation if its final outcomes don't actually reflect what the community itself defined as success? Or if their input doesn't fundamentally alter the project's direction at all? It often feels like we're just checking a box, for a donor report. But the core dynamics of who decides and who benefits, they just stay the same. It's like a community being asked to prioritize problems only to find the external organization ends up funding a solution to a problem they ranked, like last.
Yeah, and this raises a really important question about the whole performance of participation. Kothari discusses this vividly, how participation can become this front stage activity, something performed meticulously for external observers, like donors or evaluators. And this front stage performance is often quite distinct from the backstage discussions, the crucial decisions happening among the implementers, the consultants, their partners, often behind closed doors. The chapter really reveals a significant ethical tension here for facilitators or managers working in these spaces. When you realize you're part of a process that is essentially tokenistic, one that might look fantastic on a log frame, that standard project planning tool, or in an M&E report for monitoring and evaluation. But where nothing fundamentally changes on the ground for the community, what's your responsibility then? Do you call it out? Do you stay quiet and kind of complicit? Or do you attempt to redesign the process from within, which often means pushing against significant institutional resistance? And what's particularly profound here, I think, is Kothari's concept of the purification of knowledge. This is the subtle, often unconscious process where certain forms of knowledge, particularly local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, non-Western ways of knowing, are systematically marginalized or devalued or even dismissed entirely. And they're dismissed in favor of what's deemed scientific or expert or true by external, often Western institutions. The really deep insight here is that whose knowledge gets validated directly shapes whose voice matters and whose reality defines the project itself. So if local wisdom about farming practices, let's say, or traditional healing methods, is silenced in favor of external expertise that comes from academic journals or international best practices, well, that's a direct mechanism of control, even if it's disguised as best practice. It means that even when people are technically participating, their own lived experiences, their accumulated wisdom, might not even be recognized as legitimate knowledge within the project's framework.
Right. Which leads us perfectly to talking about the tools. Now, tools, they're everywhere in development work, aren't they? You think of PRA, participatory rural appraisal, those diagrams, stakeholder maps, community scorecards. These were initially designed, I think, with good intentions to give voice and empower. But here's the critical pause Kothari asks us to take. Have these tools and their very widespread application maybe become standardized rituals, rituals that actually replace real, nuanced relationships? Are we confusing just using a tool, filling out a matrix, drawing a quick diagram with the much harder work of actually building genuine trust and understanding? Because you can fill out a matrix about community assets, sure, but does that mean you truly connected with the person filling it out or understood their deeper hopes and fears?
That's a key critique. Kothari critically examines how these tools, while they seem neutral and objective and were designed to foster participation, can actually become technical instruments. Instruments that reinforce the very limitations of participation they were supposed to overcome. PRA, for instance, despite its noble origins, has faced a lot of criticism over the years for sometimes becoming superficial, potentially manipulative even, and for often obscuring the actual power relations at play. This contributes to what critics, including Cook and Kothari themselves in the book's title, call a new tyranny of participation. And this new tyranny, it isn't about traditional dictatorships, obviously. It's about the subtle, often well-intentioned ways that processes designed for liberation can actually become restrictive. They can dictate terms, subtly undermining genuine agency. So this raises another important question. Can quantitative indicators, things like attendance records at community meetings or counting the number of feedback forms collected, can those really capture the quality, the authenticity of participation? Or are they just numbers we plug into reports mainly to satisfy donors without reflecting any deeper, more meaningful engagement or actual power shifts? And the chapter also points out how the definition of a good participant often gets subtly defined by the external actors. It's usually someone who is perhaps educated, articulate in a certain way, willing to use the specific tools provided, expresses themselves in expected, often westernized ways. And this implicitly excludes many within a community whose ways of knowing or communicating or simply engaging might be different. It inadvertently marginalizes the very voices that might be most crucial to hear.
Yeah. And this leads us to what I found one of Kothari's most crucial contributions, a concept that really shifted my own thinking. It's the distinction she makes between invited spaces and claimed spaces. How do we move from spaces that are merely offered by institutions, where the rules, the agenda, the parameters are already set by the external body, to spaces that are truly claimed by communities themselves, spaces where they set the agenda, they define the terms, and they really own the process?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, allowing communities to genuinely claim space, well, it means they might actually be allowed to say no. Think about that for a moment. The freedom to refuse a project outright, or to redirect its objectives significantly, or even just to choose not to participate in a predetermined way that doesn't suit them. Now, this introduces pretty significant institutional risks for organizations, doesn't it? Especially those accountable to funders who have very specific targets and timelines. When communities are truly empowered to refuse, or maybe to demonstrate what institutions might perceive as resistance or even social deviance by turning their own course, it fundamentally challenges that traditional power dynamic. It means shifting from a model where institutions invite participation, but always on their terms, to one where community agency is truly honored, where their collective will, even if it goes against the planned project, is respected. It's really moving from a project designed for them to perhaps a solution conceived and implemented by them.
Okay, so before we close today's deep dive, let's maybe turn the mirror inward for a moment.
Yeah.
As facilitators, as researchers, as CSR leads, how often do we truly audit our own positionality in the field? How often do we recognize our own inherent role in shaping these participatory processes, even if it's unconsciously? How much of our own bias, our own institutional pressures, our own need to show results to funders, how much of that are we inadvertently bringing into these spaces? It's not just about what the community does, is it? It's also about what we do and how our very presence impacts the dynamic.
That's right. And this raises a really important question for any practitioner out there. How do we respond when the community's voice or their insights or their desired path genuinely challenges the project's stated objectives or challenges the neat log frame we've already drawn up and submitted? Do we genuinely adapt the project based on their insights, even if that means changing direction, maybe delaying timelines or having difficult conversations with donors? Or do we perhaps quietly, maybe even with good intentions, thinking it's for the best, sideline that voice to maintain our predetermined course and ensure we hit our internal targets? Kothari's work really encourages this kind of deep critical self-reflection. It pushes us to consider how our own, often well-meaning practices, even when we sincerely believe we're fostering participation, can unwittingly perpetuate forms of control. There's always more to learn, always more to question when dealing with such complex dynamics of power and knowledge, especially in the pursuit of genuine transformative development. And it also begs that question of whether communities should actually be compensated for their time, their labor, their emotional energy during these often intensive processes, or does that payment then shift the spirit of co-creation into more of a transaction? That's another layer to consider.
Absolutely. So as you reflect on today's deep dive, maybe ask yourself this. In the last project you worked on, who truly owned the decisions? Was it genuinely the community's vision that was driving the work forward? And maybe think about this too. If you weren't in the room, if your organization suddenly stepped away, would that process still go forward without you? Would it sustain itself? That's all for today. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.